Best practice in Python for return value on error versus success. In general, let's say you have a method like the below. In this particular method, when errors are found, I would not want to return the empty list in this case because that could have been the real answer to this specific method call. I want to return something to indicate the parameters were incorrect. So I return false on error in this case, and a list otherwise, empty or not. My question is, what is the best practice in areas like this, and not just for lists? Return whatever the heck I want and make sure I document it for a user to read? Smile, what do most of you folks do? If on success you were supposed to return true or false and you catch an error? If on success you were supposed to return a list and you catch an error? If on success you were supposed to return a file handle and you catch an error? Etc.
First, whatever you do, don't return a result and an error message. That's a really bad way to handle errors and will cause you endless headaches. If you need to indicate an error, always raise an exception. I usually tend to avoid raising errors unless it is necessary. In your example, throwing an error is not really needed. Intersecting an empty list with a non-empty one is not an error. The result is just empty list, and that is correct. But let's say you want to handle other cases. For example, if the method got a non-list type. In this case, it is better to raise an exception. Exceptions are nothing to be afraid of. My advice for you is to look at the Python library for similar functions and see how Python handles those special cases. For example, have a look at the intersection method in set. It tends to be forgiving. Here I'm trying to intersect an empty set with an empty list. Errors are only thrown when needed. Sure, there are cases where returning true or false on success or failure can be good. But it is very important to be consistent. The function should always return the same type or structure. It is very confusing to have a function that could return a list or a boolean. Or return the same type, but the meaning of this value can be different in case of an error. Edit. The op says, I want to return something to indicate the parameters were incorrect. Nothing says there is an error better than an exception. If you want to indicate the parameters are incorrect, then use exceptions and put a helpful error message. Returning a result in this case is just confusing. There might be other cases where you want to indicate that nothing has happened but it is not an error. For example, if you have a method that deletes entries from a table and the entry requested for deletion does not exist. In this case, it might be fine to just return true or false on success or failure. It depends on the application and the intended behavior.
It would be better to raise an exception than return a special value. This is exactly what exceptions were designed for, to replace error codes with a more robust and structured error handling mechanism. In this specific case though, I'd probably just drop the tests. There's nothing wrong with intersecting empty lists, really. Also, Lambda is sort of discouraged these days in preference to list comprehensions. See find intersection of two nested lists. for a couple of ways to write this without using Lambda.
I like to return a tuple. True, sum underscore result. False, sum underscore useful underscore response. The sum underscore useful underscore response object can be used for handling the return condition or can serve to display debugging info. Note, this technique applies for return values of any sort. It should not be mistaken with exception cases. On the receiving end, you just have to unpack. Code, response equals sum underscore function. This technique applies for the normal control flow. One must use the exception functionality when some unexpected inputs, processing occur. Also worth noting, this technique helps normalizing function returns. Both the programmer and the user of the functions know what to expect. Disclaimer, I come from an Erlang background. Smile.
Exceptions are definitely better, and more Pythonic, than status returns. For much more on this, exceptions versus status returns.
Vielen Dank, Lehrer und Lehrerstudien.